It was one of the darkest days in the history of Earth. On a single mysterious day, every human being on Earth suddenly disappeared. But humans were not the only ones affected. Across the universe, many planets and celestial bodies near Earth also vanished without warning. No one knew what had happened, and no one could explain where they had gone. The most terrifying part was that the water found on one of those mysterious planets was strangely similar to human blood. And for humans, even coming into contact with this substance could result in certain death. Despite facing such a horrifying environment, one man eventually managed to survive. And today, we're going to find out how he endured this nightmare. The story begins in the future, when humanity is already struggling to survive. At this time, people are talking about an event known as the Quiet Rapture. It was an event surrounded by so much mystery that, even after extensive research, no human had been able to discover the complete truth behind it. According to what was known, something suddenly happened that caused almost all humans on Earth to disappear. Earth itself was also destroyed, along with several other planets. The only people who survived were those who happened to be outside Earth at the time. They were either aboard spaceships or living inside space stations. The survivors desperately searched for another planet where humanity could start over. They explored many different locations, but finding a suitable world was almost impossible. Eventually, they discovered several strange moons. Unfortunately, most of them were completely unsuitable for human habitation. However, one moon was very different from all the others. Its entire surface was covered by an enormous ocean. But this was not an ordinary ocean. The liquid covering the surface was actually blood. After collecting samples and testing them, scientists discovered something unbelievable. The liquid was biologically similar to human blood. Because of this discovery, the scientists named the mysterious place the Blood Ocean. They believed that studying this strange ocean might help them understand what had happened to humanity. Perhaps they could uncover the reason behind the Quiet Rapture and discover something that could help humans begin a new life. For that reason, several teams were sent to investigate the Blood Ocean. Among them was a man named Simon. At this moment, Simon was inside a specially designed submarine. This type of submarine was known as an iron lung, and Simon was preparing to travel deep beneath the surface of the mysterious ocean. Simon was receiving instructions through the submarine's communication system. Someone from the command center was telling him what he needed to do and when he needed to do it. Simon was also hearing strange sounds through the radio. His mission was extremely dangerous because he was going deeper into a place where no human had ever properly explored. Simon was the first person to attempt this particular mission. He had been instructed to reach a specific depth, perform several scans, and take photographs of the surrounding area. All of the images and information he collected had to be sent directly back to the command center for analysis. As Simon continued descending, a few drops of liquid suddenly entered the submarine. He immediately realized that the blood ocean was somehow leaking into the vessel. At the same time, the commander was talking about something called Philemon Station over the radio. Unfortunately, Simon couldn't clearly understand what the commander was saying. Simon tried to ask about it, but the commander ignored the question and told him to concentrate on his mission. Simon was completely alone inside the submarine. There was nobody beside him who could help if something went wrong. After warning Simon to remain careful, the commander finally ended the communication. A short while later, Simon realized that his submarine had reached an extremely deep part of the ocean. According to the information available to him, this was one of the deepest areas that had ever been explored. Simon became nervous when he realized how far he had traveled from the surface. He then opened a research file that had been stored inside the submarine. The file contained detailed information about the mission and the equipment. Simon learned that the submarine had been specially designed for liquid photography. It could capture extremely clear images of different types of liquids, even under difficult conditions. The research file also contained detailed instructions explaining how to operate the submarine's special features. Simon carefully studied the instructions for the camera. He needed to follow a specific procedure whenever he wanted to take a photograph. Then he discovered another camera system installed inside the submarine. Simon noticed a small light glowing near the camera. In the middle of that light was something that looked like a button. He realized that pressing it would activate the external camera. Simon decided to test it before continuing his mission. The camera turned on, and an image appeared on the display. The image seemed to show something resembling a map. Simon examined it carefully, trying to understand its exact location. But while doing this, he noticed another problem. The oxygen level inside the submarine was slowly decreasing. If the oxygen continued to fall at that rate, Simon could eventually find himself in serious danger. The submarine had four different oxygen levels, represented by four lights. As the oxygen decreased, the lights changed accordingly. Simon knew that he could not stay underwater forever. Still, he continued with the mission because returning to the surface without completing it was not an option. Simon moved toward one of the submarine's windows and checked the camera again. He turned on the camera's flashlight and pointed it toward the darkness outside. Then something strange appeared in the beam of light. Simon saw what looked like a huge skeleton lying outside the submarine. Simon was confused because there was not supposed to be any life in this area. Yet the skeleton was clearly visible. He wondered how something so large could have ended up here. Meanwhile, the pressure inside the submarine was continuing to rise, and the temperature inside was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Because of the increasing pressure and heat, water began dripping from the upper part of the submarine. Some areas had also started developing leaks. Through those openings, the strange blood-like liquid was entering the submarine. Simon realized that the situation was becoming much more dangerous than he had expected. Then Simon noticed something even more disturbing. According to the map, he was now in a location that shouldn't exist. Somehow, the submarine had traveled much farther than the planned route. Simon became extremely nervous and immediately tried to contact the command center through the radio. He repeatedly asked the commander what he should do if the location he had reached was not shown on the map. But this time, there was no answer. Simon tried again and again, but the speaker remained silent. He began to suspect that the signal was no longer strong enough to reach the command center. Simon checked the photographs he had taken. As he looked through them, he slowly realized that something was seriously wrong. Then, without warning, the submarine began receiving an unknown signal from somewhere outside. Simon quickly moved toward the control system to find out where the signal was coming from. The strange signal frightened Simon. He had no idea what could possibly be transmitting it from the depths of the blood ocean. But after a few moments, the signal suddenly disappeared by itself. Simon barely had time to process what had happened when he felt the submarine begin to shake. At first, Simon thought the submarine had simply been disturbed by an underwater current, but the movement quickly became stronger. It felt as though something enormous had climbed onto the submarine. Simon prepared himself to investigate, but suddenly the entire submarine began shaking violently. It seemed as though some gigantic creature was attacking the submarine. Then came a powerful impact. The submarine was hit so hard that Simon was thrown to the floor. At the same time, the navigation lights began blinking continuously, suggesting that the system was detecting something unusual outside. Simon was becoming more frightened with every passing second. He had no idea what was moving around the submarine. Then, unexpectedly, the radio signal returned. The commander was finally able to communicate with him again. Simon immediately sent all of the photographs he had taken during the mission. When the commander saw the photograph showing the enormous skeleton, he was shocked. He immediately ordered Simon to return toward the surface. Using the submarine's control system, Simon began ascending. After some time, the submarine finally reached the surface. where the commander was waiting to speak with him. However, the commander did not enter the submarine. Instead, he stood outside and talked to Simon through the submarine's glass. He wanted to know exactly what had happened. Simon explained that several parts of the submarine were leaking, and that the strange, blood-like liquid was continuously entering through those leaks. Simon then reminded the commander about their original agreement. He had been told that once he completed the research and collected the required photographs and information, he would be allowed to leave. But now, nobody was saying anything about releasing him. Simon began to suspect that the commander's real plan was completely different. The commander walked away briefly to discuss something with another person. Simon noticed that the commander had strange scars across his face, and one of his eyes appeared to be damaged. Simon became increasingly uncomfortable. He finally told the commander to get him out of there as quickly as possible because he had already completed the job. But the commander refused. He explained that they needed a physical sample from the enormous skeleton. They wanted to attach a special device to the front of Simon's submarine. When the device came into contact with the skeleton, it would capture a small piece of it. Simon immediately understood how dangerous this request was. He had already seen evidence that some enormous creature might be living deep beneath the ocean. Going back down there meant putting his life at tremendous risk. Simon argued that there was no safe way for him to return to that location. But the commander didn't want to hear any excuses. He insisted that Simon complete the mission. At one point, another person standing near the submarine became extremely angry. In anger, he pressed one of the camera buttons, causing a special image to appear on the display. The image looked similar to an X-ray. It showed to people working near the mysterious device. Simon immediately realized that something was wrong. He asked what they had done and whether they understood the danger of using that camera. Simon explained that the camera used a special type of radiation to photograph objects beneath the blood ocean. This allowed the scientists to see things hidden deep beneath the liquid, but the same radiation could be extremely dangerous to ordinary humans. Anyone caught within the effective range of that radiation could die. Simon was horrified when he realized that several people might lose their lives because of this technology. He felt responsible for what was happening, even though he had never intended for anyone to be harmed. Despite everything, the commander still ordered Simon to continue. He wanted Simon to descend into the blood ocean one final time and collect the skeleton sample. Simon listened carefully and slowly realized that the sample must be considered extremely valuable by the people in command. After thinking about the situation, Simon prepared himself to descend once again. The submarine moved toward the bottom of the blood ocean. Once he reached the required depth, Simon was informed through the speaker that the radiation exposure had severely damaged the commander's body. The person who was with the commander had also been exposed to the radiation. Both of them were now in an extremely serious condition. Simon was told that he had only around 30 minutes to complete the mission. Within that limited time, he had to collect the sample and return to the surface. Simon began taking photographs of the area once again. He knew that every second mattered. Suddenly, the radio signal disappeared again. For a moment, the submarine became completely silent. Then Simon heard the sound of something like a fire extinguisher being used somewhere through the communication system. The strange sound continued for a short time and then suddenly stopped. Simon continued using the camera to examine his surroundings. While doing so, the camera's flashlight revealed a hidden compartment. Simon became curious and moved closer to investigate it. When he opened the compartment, he discovered several wires and other equipment inside. Simon thought that connecting the wires in the correct way might reveal some hidden information, so he followed the instructions and carefully connected them. A few moments later, a message appeared inside the submarine. The message explained that the person who had written it knew that more researchers would eventually arrive at the submarine. But according to the message, those people were not actually being sent here for research. The truth was much darker. The message explained that this mission was actually an execution. Anyone who came here was unlikely to return alive. The researcher who had written the message had also been sent here under the same false promise of conducting research. The message continued by explaining that the sample itself had almost no real value. By this point, Earth and almost everything else had already been destroyed. Humanity was desperately searching for hope, believing that somewhere they might be able to begin again. But according to the message, that hope was meaningless. There was no real future left for humanity. The previous researcher had arrived in the submarine just as Simon had. However, he had never managed to return to the surface. Before his death, that researcher had left a message behind for the next person who would enter the submarine. Simon now understood that he might be facing the exact same fate. Still, he had no choice but to continue moving forward. Simon began examining all the photographs he had taken. Just like before, he noticed strange markings appearing on the map. The more he studied them, the more he began to understand what was happening around him. But another terrifying realization was waiting for him. Because of the enormous amount of radiation, Simon realized that he might die within only a few days. He also remembered that he had activated the radiation in front of the commander and Jack. That meant they had been exposed as well, and radiation poisoning could eventually kill them. Simon continued moving through the submarine while taking more photographs. Then the radio speaker suddenly turned on again. The commander wanted to talk to him. He asked Simon how far away he was and ordered him to find the required sample as quickly as possible. But the pressure inside the submarine was increasing rapidly. The interior was becoming extremely hot, and water was beginning to leak through several places. Simon realized that the submarine might not survive much longer under these conditions. Simon apologized to the commander for what he had done. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, and that there was no way to undo it. However, the commander did not spend much time discussing the mistake. Instead, they continued talking about what was happening around them. Simon finally asked a difficult question. He wanted to know why they were putting themselves through so much suffering for people who might eventually die anyway. They had already risked their own lives, yet the future of humanity still looked hopeless. The commander then said something that shocked Simon. He mentioned Philemon Station and asked whether this was the reason Simon had destroyed it. Simon immediately became nervous when he heard the name of the station. Simon tried to explain that he had never intentionally destroyed Philemon Station. He wanted the commander to understand that whatever had happened there was not something he had deliberately planned. At this point, only the people who had been living in space stations or traveling in spaceships had survived. Philemon Station was one of those surviving stations. After ending the conversation with the commander, Simon continued taking photographs. Then he noticed something strange in one of the images. It seemed as though something was moving beneath the blood ocean. The commander told Simon that the strange image might simply be caused by underwater gas or currents. According to him, the creature Simon believed he had seen might not even be real. It could simply be a result of Simon's exhausted and frightened mind. The commander ordered Simon to collect the sample and return to the surface as quickly as possible. Simon then asked a question that had been troubling him. He wanted to know whether the commander would kill him once he returned to the surface. The commander was surprised by the question. He asked Simon why they would kill him, but then he reminded Simon that the radiation had already spread throughout his body. There was no time to waste talking about what might happen later. Simon decided to stop thinking about his fate and concentrate entirely on completing the mission. He moved the submarine closer to the enormous skeleton. The oxygen level was still dropping, and Simon knew that he was running out of time. Using the remaining strength he had, Simon created pressure inside the submarine. Then he accelerated the submarine at full speed and drove it directly toward the skeleton. His goal was to make the device attached to the submarine capture a sample from it. But while doing this, the camera's flashlight suddenly turned on. Simon appeared to notice something unusual. Then the story takes us into a flashback. We see a strange scene in space, where enormous trees appear to be growing in a mysterious environment. Underneath one of those trees, several children can be seen standing. The entire scene looks almost magical, but there is something unusual about the stars in the background. The stars we see are actually stars that died many years ago. The light coming from those stars is not their current light. It is simply the remaining light being reflected from them. The strange image gives the impression that Simon may be seeing something connected to the distant past. We return to Simon inside the submarine. Suddenly, the submarine is being pulled downward by an unknown force. Simon struggles to control it, but the force is far too strong. Within a short time, the radio connection is completely lost. The submarine's engine also shuts down. Simon eventually regains consciousness and realizes that he is still alive. He begins taking more photographs, hoping that the images might reveal what is happening around him. While exploring the submarine, Simon discovers another secret compartment. It has been hidden in a way that makes it extremely difficult to find. Simon tries several times to open it, but the door refuses to move. Nearby, Simon finds another compartment containing a box. Inside the box is a pair of scissors. He realizes that he might be able to use them to cut or manipulate something near the hidden compartment. Simon uses the scissors and eventually manages to work on the compartment's locking mechanism. This compartment is located at the lowest part of the submarine. Using the camera's flashlight, Simon is finally able to see what is hidden inside. But Simon may have forgotten one very important detail. The flashlight itself can produce radiation. By using it for too long, he may be exposing himself to even more radiation without realizing it. Eventually, Simon manages to open the compartment door. Inside, he discovers a restart button. He presses it, and suddenly the submarine's engine starts running again. For a moment, Simon feels relieved. But that relief doesn't last long. The submarine is still sitting at the very bottom of the ocean. When the engine starts, enormous pressure builds around the vessel. The windows begin developing cracks because they can no longer withstand the pressure. Simon activates a special protective system. The cracks begin to repair themselves, but the process is too slow. Before one of the windows can completely recover, the enormous pressure causes it to break. The blood-like liquid from the ocean immediately begins rushing into the submarine. Simon quickly tries to seal the broken window before the situation becomes even worse. At the same time, he once again feels that something is nearby. After everything he has experienced, Simon's mental condition is becoming increasingly unstable. He has been alone for too long, surrounded by darkness, radiation, strange creatures, and constant danger. He begins struggling to understand which things are real and which might be hallucinations. Suddenly, a fire breaks out near the engine. Simon grabs several fire extinguishers and desperately tries to control it. He eventually manages to bring the fire under control, but while doing so, he feels as though something is moving somewhere nearby. Simon becomes frightened and begins losing control of his emotions. At the same time, the submarine system repeatedly warns him about the dangerous conditions. Simon has already been exposed to radiation, and now he is physically exhausted as well. During all of this, Simon suffers an injury. He manages to treat himself using the first aid kit inside the submarine. But there is no safe place for him to rest. Every moment he spends there increases the danger. Simon realizes that he must find a way out. He moves toward one of the submarine's windows and looks outside. Suddenly, he sees a strange living creature in the darkness. The creature is visible only for a moment before it disappears again. Simon is now certain that something alive is actually living down here. His fear increases even more because he knows that he is not alone in the blood ocean. Using the camera, Simon begins seeing different kinds of mysterious creatures. Every new image makes the situation more terrifying. Simon is exhausted, frightened, and mentally overwhelmed, so he stops for a short while and sits quietly inside the submarine. After gathering himself, Simon starts moving forward again. Eventually, he reaches another submarine. The name of the submarine is SM-8. Simon approaches it carefully and connects his system to the ZIM-8E system. Several images immediately appear on the monitor. Simon realizes that these photographs may have been taken by the people who were inside the SM-8. He continues going through the images, hoping to discover some clue about what happened to them. Then Simon reaches the final photograph. What he sees completely shocks him. The photograph appears to have been taken from extremely close to the same strange creature that Simon had seen earlier. The location shown in the photograph has also been marked on a map. Simon studies the map carefully. Then he realizes something terrifying. The path he has been following seems to be bringing him back to the same location again and again. Simon realizes that he may be trapped inside some kind of loop. No matter how far he travels, he somehow ends up returning to the same place. Before he can understand the reason, the radio speaker suddenly becomes active again. A woman's voice comes through the speaker. Simon listens carefully and realizes that the woman appears to be trapped inside another submarine. She is desperately asking someone to rescue her. Simon tries to calm her down and begins communicating with her. Simon decides not to wait for the commander. He attempts to bring his submarine toward the surface on his own. But suddenly, the oxygen alarm begins ringing. The oxygen level has dropped dangerously low, and the woman can hear the alarm as well. The woman then tells Simon that they are inside a place called the Quiet Rapture. Simon immediately becomes interested and asks her to explain more about it. But her response is strange. She tells Simon that she never said anything about the Quiet Rapture. Simon becomes confused. He starts wondering whether he is hallucinating. After everything that has happened, he can no longer be certain whether the voices he hears are real. The woman then gives him a location and says that if Simon can reach it, they might both be able to escape. Simon begins moving toward the location she gives him. Then the woman mentions Philemon Station. She says that the station was destroyed a long time ago. Her words immediately make Simon uncomfortable because he knows that the commander has already mentioned the station. Then the woman suddenly asks Simon whether he was responsible for the destruction of Philemon Station. Simon is shocked. He tries to explain that he did not destroy the station intentionally and that someone else was responsible for what happened there. The woman does not seem convinced. She tells Simon that she believes everything happening to him now may be punishment for his actions. According to her, Simon is suffering because he destroyed Philemon Station. Simon continues trying to explain himself, but the situation becomes stranger. In the distance, he notices something that looks like a small light. At the same time, the woman's words become increasingly confusing. She begins saying that they are moving toward their destination. She claims that this is where they are supposed to go and that reaching it will finally free them. Simon listens carefully, but something about her voice and her words feels completely wrong. Then Simon notices something terrifying. The communication line connected to the speaker appears to have already been cut. There should be no active connection through which anyone could be speaking to him. Simon realizes that the woman's voice may not actually be coming from the radio. Simon becomes frightened as the woman's voice slowly fades away. He is left alone once again inside the submarine. The darkness surrounds him, the oxygen is running low, and the pressure continues to increase. Meanwhile, the submarine suddenly comes to a complete stop. Simon sits inside, trying to understand what has just happened. He has already discovered that the mission was not what he had been told. and now he may be trapped inside a mysterious loop with no clear way back to the surface.